Hello and welcome to Diecast Diaries. I'm Dan. I've got some Matchbox Collectibles tanks today. Matchbox Collectibles started out in the early 90s as a development of the earlier yesteryear range, which featured a lot of pre-war cars, trucks and vans and things like that, with the thinking being that they'd do better if marketed as adult collectibles rather than the toys, which of course is what Matchbox is mostly associated with. The yesteryear vehicles always were a lot more detailed than any of the other toys that Matchbox produced. So throughout the 90s, under the Collectibles brand, quite a range of vehicles would be produced. And in 1998, Matchbox released the Great Tanks of the World range. So this consisted of 8 1/72 scale vehicles. I don't think the castings are original to Matchbox. Some of them look very similar to models produced by an Italian company, or I think they were Italian, called CDC Armour. That's another company that I don't believe is going anymore. But they certainly did a range of 1/72 vehicles, and some of them look very similar to some of the Matchbox ones in this range. Certainly, these are vehicles that never appeared under the Matchbox name in any other guise. All of the vehicles are from World War II, so really calling the collection Great Tanks of the Second World War would have probably been a more appropriate name for it. Even then, although 5 of the models undoubtedly qualify as such, the remaining 3 are a little bit more questionable. So the first one is the Sherman, a tank that any collection of tanks from the Second World War really has to include. This particular one, it's an M4A3 and it's the 76mm version. So this would have come into service about July 44, so kind of not too long after D-Day. And it was kind of the first attempt to kind of give the Sherman a bit more hitting power, especially as it was coming up against the heavier German tanks like the Panther and the Tiger a lot more commonly. Reasonably successful. It did have more kind of armour penetration than the earlier 75mm version, but still not in the same league as the German tanks. And the high explosive shell that it fired for use against infantry on unarmoured targets, things like that, not as effective as the one from the earlier 75mm gun. So a bit of a compromise, really. So it's got a longer barrel compared to kind of the more commonly seen earlier version of the Sherman. And to offset the extra weight of that, it has a larger turret so that a counterweight could be fitted at the back to offset the extra weight of the gun barrel. It's in sort of pretty generic markings, probably about as generic US Army markings as you can get, although it does have an individual number on the side, so it must represent a specific tank. And on the front, it does have markings indicating it belongs to the 4th Armoured Division. So that's a unit that was in service in Northwest Europe, kind of from the sort of through battles through France, Belgium, and on into Germany. So certainly entirely appropriate for this. Model itself, it's mostly metal. All the sort of hull and turret are metal. The gun barrel is plastic, but at least it's all painted the same colour, so it's not obviously plastic. And then obviously you've got little accessories like the machine gun and other little bits, like these boxes on the back. They're all plastic as well. Now these are clearly meant as models, not toys. So working features are limited to the turret traversing, and that's it. I did think the gun barrel might elevate and depress, but it's plastic. It doesn't seem to have any movement, and I certainly don't want to force it anymore, as I think it will just snap off. So the colour green does seem a little bit off on this. I think normally you'd expect it to be a bit of a darker green, but other than that, it's a pretty nice model. So you've got the 50 caliber machine gun on top of the turret there. You've got the 30 caliber bow mounted machine gun there. So yeah, it's pretty nice model, and it's nice to see a sort of slightly more uncommon version of the Sherman. There's a lot of the models of Shermans that are just as the kind of normal 75mm one, so it's nice to see that they've done the upgunned version. So that's the first one. Now on this one, as I say, I mentioned that I don't think these models originally belonged to original Matchbox ones. It is actually branded as Dinky underneath. The Matchbox bought the rights to the Dinky name at some point. Obviously, Dinky themselves ceased in 1980, but the rights to the name was bought by Matchbox, or probably more Mattel, more accurately. You can see it does say Mattel underneath there as well. So yeah, the Dinky branding was used. Now they're certainly not obviously Dinky castings. As I say, I do think they are CDC Armour. But yeah, so that's the Sherman, and then the tank that the upgunned Sherman was meant to counter was the Panther. So this is a Type A Panther, so this is like the earliest version of it that would have entered service in about mid-43. Panther's combat debut came at the Battle of Kursk on the Eastern Front, which is the largest tank battle in history. Although the Panther would end up being quite a formidable tank, it actually had quite an inauspicious start at Kursk. I think a lot of its teething troubles hadn't been ironed out, and the first ones to enter combat ended up being sort of mechanical basket cases, really, with a lot of them breaking down. That is something that plagued German tanks through to the end of the war, a combination of being kind of probably overly complicated, your factories being under constant bombardment by the RAF and the US Army Air Force, and also, in some cases, a lot of your vehicles being produced by slave labour. None of those are conducive to getting a lot of vehicles in full working order. But yeah, certainly the Panther did end up being a very formidable tank. So it has a long-barrelled 75mm gun, decent thickness of armour and well-sloped as well, and wide tracks, which means it's sort of good over sort of soft terrain. Noticeably wider tracks than the Sherman has. That was one kind of feature of like the Sherman, is that the tracks were quite narrow. So going over sort of soft or boggy terrain, it could end up getting stuck in, whereas tanks like the Panther would have a better chance of getting over them, even though it's probably actually a heavier tank. The colour scheme on this one, it does look like a desert scheme. Obviously, Panthers were never used in the North Africa campaign. As I say, this is a Type A Panther, so it's probably one that dates from like the summer of '43, which would obviously tie it into Kursk. There are areas of Russia where this kind of camouflage would be quite appropriate, so I'm thinking that's what it's from. But again, it's another really nice detailed model, and again, the working feature is limited to the turret traversing. Again, obviously the gun barrel is plastic. But yeah, nice detail on that one. So that's the Type A Panther. And then the tank that the Panther was produced to counter, and another tank that any collection of World War II tanks shouldn't be without, is the T-34. So in this case, we've got the T-34-76, which is the early war version armed with the 76mm gun. Now, in my previous video, which I did on a range of Russian-made 1-43 scale vehicles, I included the T-34-85 was part of that. Well, that has a noticeably bigger turret and certainly a noticeably longer gun barrel. But this is the version that would have been in service right at the start of the war. Gave the Germans, I think, quite a shock when they launched Operation Barbarossa in June 41. Heavily armoured for the time, a decent gun for the time as well. And unlike a lot of German tanks, this one's far simpler to make, so it could be made in absolutely huge numbers, and indeed they were. Also far simpler to maintain. Got the sort of slogans on the turret. I unfortunately don't know what that means, but it was quite a common feature of Russian tanks, is they had some kind of slogan on the turret, usually saying "for the motherland" or something like that, or for Moscow, or anything like that, any kind of patriotic slogan. It was quite a common thing for Russian tanks to feature. It's in a nice sort of colour scheme, this, as well as sort of green and khaki. Again, I'm guessing it does represent a specific tank, but not found which one it is exactly. You see the details sort of nice on this one. You've got the external fuel tanks on the side, bow machine gun. Nice aerial on this one. The aerials do have a bit of bend to them, so they're not as fragile as they might first appear. And again, you've got a rotating turret. And yeah, that's it. Plastic gun barrel again. So that's the T-34-76. As I say, an absolute sort of shoe-in for any sort of great tanks collection. And then the next one, we actually have a British tank in the form of the Churchill, specifically a Churchill Mark VII. So the Churchill was a tank that had been in service throughout most of the war. The Mark VII was the later version. I think it was the last version of it to enter service. Certainly it's the one that saw action through to the end of the war. I'm not sure exactly when it came into service, possibly sometime in '43, but certainly it saw action in the Normandy campaign and throughout the rest of the campaign in Northwest Europe. British tanks tended to fall into two different categories. On one hand, you had cruiser tanks, which had thinner armour, were much faster, intended for kind of like scouting ahead. They sort of were represented by tanks such as the Crusader, the Comet, Cromwell, things like that. And then you had infantry tanks, which, as the name suggests, were meant for direct support of the infantry. And these tended to be far more heavily armoured and also much, much slower. And the Churchill, I think, had a top speed of around 15 miles an hour. So, yeah, not very fast at all. But if you're supporting infantry, of course, it's not so crucial. It's fairly well armoured. has, I think it's a 75mm gun, again, traversing turret. And then you've got a bow-mounted machine gun in the middle there. Quite an unusual looking tank, really. Earlier versions can almost hark back to the First World War tanks, because the tracks along the top were exposed, sort of much like the sort of First World War tanks were. But later versions like this, the top of the tracks were enclosed. The Churchill, although it was sort of kind of a bit outdated, I suppose, it would prove to be quite an adaptable tank. There was a version that came into service, I think, about 44, called the Crocodile, which had an armoured trailer carrying fuel. And instead of the machine gun in the middle there, it had a flame projector, proved very effective against German fortifications such as the Siegfried Line. Also, very valuable from a psychological point of view. Certainly, if you've got one of those coming to you, belching flame, you're not going to sort of stay in your position for too long, I wouldn't have thought. Also, there'll be a lot of these adapted for use for D-Day, invasion of France. They've proved to be able to be converted to a number of different specialist tanks for overcoming all the different fortifications. So the ones that carried bridges on them, ones that carried ramps, or bundles of sticks called fascines for dropping into anti-tank ditches so that vehicles can then drive over them. So there were a lot of different uses. There were also some that were fitted with a large demolition gun, specifically for dealing with German fortifications, pillboxes, gun emplacements, and that kind of thing. So it would prove to be a pretty adaptable tank. And I think this one is possibly, I think that badge on is 79th Armoured Division. I think it is anyway, which was a unit that was equipped with a lot. And they were called the Funnies because they all look quite odd. But yeah, so that's the Churchill Mark VII. Unfortunately, that's the only British tank in the collection, but it's a nice model, that. The tracks are sort of quite silvery on this, which I'm not sure is too sort of authentic, but they don't look too bad, I suppose. So that's the Churchill. And then we have another German tank in the form of the Panzer Mark IV. And this is a later war model of the Panzer Mark IV. This is either a H or J model. So this is the later one, armed with a long-barreled 75mm gun. This particular one actually has sort of side skirts fitted as well. It was a feature of a number of German armoured vehicles, and it was an attempt to kind of defeat sort of handheld anti-tank weapons, things like the bazooka, to try and protect the tracks. They were sort of fairly flimsy. You can see there is a sort of gap, so I think the idea was to detonate the weapon before it could get anywhere close to the actual vehicle. You would end up getting knocked off quite a bit in combat, but it was certainly a feature of German tanks. You see, the Panther does have some to a degree as well, but they're far more extensive on this. So the Panzer Mark IV is kind of the mainstay of the German armoured forces during World War II, although, as I mentioned, a lot of Allied after-action reports made constant mention of Panthers, Tigers, King Tigers. Really, it was the Panzer IV that was by far the most common. It's a fairly sort of basic tank. There's nothing really sort of special about it. It does have a powerful gun, but in terms of the armour, it's not particularly sloped at all. I don't think it's particularly thick. I think they were just there in decent numbers, and it would prove to be a sort of a pretty adaptable tank, I think, as well. So this is the one that, as I say, really kind of was the absolute backbone of the German armoured forces. So again, it's also kind of got extra armour around the turret as well. You can see it's got sort of spaced armour around there to try and detonate any weapons before they penetrate the actual turret. So we've got a revolving turret. Again, I think all of them have got just like a plastic gun barrel, and things like the skirts on the side are plastic, but the rest of it's all metal. In terms of the colour scheme, it could be from a number of campaigns. It could be Russian front, it could be Normandy, could even be Italian campaign. This is a tank used in kind of all theatres that the Germans fought in, so it could come from a number of those. But yes, that's the late war Panzer Mark IV. So those first 5 tanks, I think, all perfectly normal to sort of include in a great tanks collection. Perfectly acceptable, I would say. The remaining 3 models, less so. Now, whether Matchbox included these, because, as I mentioned before, these castings I don't think are original to Matchbox, so whether they were kind of limited as to what castings they could use from another manufacturer, I don't know, but given that they were trying to do sort of great tanks of World War II, it does seem a surprise that with the ones they picked for the last 3. So the first one of those I've got is at least a tank. It's another Panzer IV, but this time it's the F1 version. So this is like the sort of first version of it. This is the version that would have been in service at the start of the war and would have been used in the Blitzkrieg campaign, so the invasion of Poland in 1939, and then the invasion of in Western Europe in 1940, so like France, Denmark, Belgium, and Holland. It's easy to remember, or easy to forget rather, that with the Germans being famous for large tanks like the Panther and the Tiger later on in the war, that at the start of the war, this was the kind of the largest tank they had, and even then, this was by no means the most numerous tank they had. In fact, this would have been probably in quite relatively small numbers. This would have been in service. Tanks like the Panzer II, only armed with a 20mm gun, would have been far more common. But yeah, so this would have been a reasonably powerful tank. It's a 75mm gun, but it's a far sort of shorter barreled one, so wouldn't have had anywhere near the hitting power of like the later ones. But that would have been a pretty powerful gun for 1939, 1940. But yeah, these tanks weren't in sort of large numbers at all. This is in the earlier German camouflage scheme of steel grey. I think most of their armoured vehicles were in this kind of colour for like the first couple of years of the war, before they started doing sort of really quite complex camouflage schemes to suit individual theatres later on. It's kind of quite an unusual colour, really. You can't imagine anywhere where it would kind of sort of fit in, really. But yeah, as I say, it was a feature of a lot of German vehicles right at the start. But yeah, although this is definitely a tank, it just seems a bit of strange that they've decided to include another version of the Panzer IV when there's so many other tanks that Matchbox could have done. Even if they wanted to do another German one, there's the Tiger. They could have done things like the Panzer III, which is obviously like the predecessor to this. It's a nice model, and it's a bit like with the 76mm version of the Sherman. The most common models you get of the Panzers IV are this later war one. So to get one of the earlier war type ones with the stubby 75mm gun, it's certainly a bit different. But yeah, it does seem a bit of a surprise that they kind of opted for another one of these. But as I say, it is at least a tank, unlike this one. Now, at first glance, this looks like another Sherman tank, and it looks like the sort of standard 75mm version, but it's actually a version fitted with a short-barreled 105mm howitzer. So this was an idea for giving armoured divisions some organic artillery support. So it's a basic Sherman tank. It's exactly the same hull, and I think quite possibly exactly the same turret as the sort of early 75mm version. But as I say, armed with quite a stubby 105mm howitzer. So it's not a vehicle that would have been intended for tank versus tank action. It would have had a much higher elevation than the standard Sherman, as I say, because none of these gun barrels move, so you can't actually show you on this. But so yeah, it would have had a much higher elevation. And as I say, it would have been a way of providing armoured divisions with their own integral artillery support. So really, you can't, although it's based on the Sherman, you can't really class it as a tank. It's, as I say, really, it's a kind of self-propelled howitzer, really. So yeah, so an unusual one again, and another one that makes me think that maybe Matchbox were limited. They were maybe thinking about other versions they could have done of the Sherman. Colour scheme is quite unusual. It's got a tank number on the side, 21, and then an individual vehicle name of Blackjack. That could suggest it's from Company B of a specific regiment. Vehicles tended to have a name beginning with the letter of whatever company they were in. It's quite an unusual camouflage scheme, certainly for an American vehicle. So what I'm thinking, there's quite a chance it could actually be a US Marine Corps vehicle from the Pacific War. Certainly you would see kind of more unusual colour schemes on vehicles out there, and it would have been a vehicle used by them. But, I think there's probably a fair chance of finding a picture of this specific one. It clearly does represent a specific vehicle. So yeah, so it's, apart from the turret and the colour scheme, it's pretty much identical to the earlier Sherman. It's got the same sort of two boxes on the back. It still has the bow machine gun. But yeah, sort of an unusual version of that, and not one that you kind of think of including within a collection of great tanks of World War II. But yeah, it's a nice model, but yeah, just not really what you class as a tank. I'll put that in the front, actually. And then the last one is kind of even less of a tank. It's yet another version of the Panzer IV, but in this case, it's the Wirbelwind anti-aircraft tank, or actually properly known as a Flakpanzer IV. So, as the name suggests, it's a mobile anti-aircraft gun, a way of giving armoured divisions some protection against the kind of marauding Allied fighter bombers. So it's the hull and sort of tracks of a Panzer IV, but with an open-topped, sort of thinly armoured turret, armed with 4 20mm cannon in like a quadruple mounting. So it was a vehicle that's very effective, could put up a devastating amount of fire. And it's, again, a really nicely done model. I would actually say this is one of my favourite models from the collection, simply because it's a bit more unusual, but certainly not what you'd class as a tank. And technically, it's like yet another version of the Panzer IV. So as I say, it may well be that Matchbox were limited to only a few different types of tanks that they could sort of use the moulds from. So they just thought, oh, well, put out another version of the Panzer IV. But yeah, it's a very nicely done model. So you've got the open top turret there, sort of nice detail inside there. The turret does move. There's no way I'm going to even attempt to see if those gun barrels move. I know from previous experience with buying an earlier one of these off eBay, and it arrived and these were broken, so I know those gun barrels are fairly fragile. Obviously that's one I've long since got rid of and replaced with this one, but yeah. The camouflage scheme, I'm thinking this is a vehicle from the sort of Normandy campaign. A lot of German vehicles were painted in this sort of colour scheme. You can see by this stage of the war, the Germans had really kind of moved on a lot from the kind of simple, and then, as I say, quite unusual colour schemes they used earlier on. They did sort of come out with some quite outlandish and complicated camouflage schemes. So yes, that's the Wirbelwind or Whirlwind anti-aircraft tank. A nice model, but yeah, just kind of a surprising one for Matchbox to do. So that's the full range. Now all of them come in the same style box, very similar to a lot of other models from the collectibles range. This is what the boxes look like. So it's actually kind of a pretty generic looking box. There's certainly nothing on the box to suggest it's got like a tank inside it, or even that Matchbox even did tanks as part of the range. You've just got a car that looks very similar to ones from the SDA range, and that's about it. The sort of blurb on the back is just generic, just talking about the sort of range in total, the collectibles range, not talking about the tanks at all. Now, each of these tanks did come with its own certificate of authenticity. So this is the one from the T-34. So on here it says T-34-76 certificate of authenticity. This is to certify that the T-34-76 is a precision-engineered die-cast model created expressly for the great tanks of the world. This intricate replica is produced by and available only from Matchbox Collectibles. And you've got a signature at the bottom of Brian James, Director of Certification, Matchbox Collectibles. So I don't think these were available in the shops at all. Now, I have seen photographs of these boxes within sort of a plain white mailer type box, so I'm thinking they might have been available as like order only. As I said, I don't think they were available from shops at all. So on the reverse of the certificate, you've just got details, quite a detailed amount of sort of history about the actual vehicle. This goes into, and as I say, in this case, it's all about the T-34, but each one came with its own certificate. So all the models I've got came off eBay. They're all pretty common. I don't think any of them have cost me more than certainly I wouldn't pay more than £20 for any of them. The Wirbelwind anti-aircraft tank's probably one of the slightly harder ones to get, whether it's because it's slightly more fragile, I'm not sure. That's one I think that cost me the most. But yeah, certainly a lot of them cost me kind of a tenner or even less in a couple of cases. So yeah, not particularly rare at all. There are some other military models I've got which fall under either the SDA or Matchbox Collectibles brands, although it is a pretty random selection of vehicles, I have to say. But they are nice models, so I think I'll probably cover those at some point. But yeah, that's the full range of Matchbox Collectibles Great Tanks of the World. So for now, I will leave it there. Please do like, share, subscribe and comment, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.